My wife cheated, handed me divorce papers. At my retirement party, our kids knew they all regret it. And it all began on what I thought was the happiest day of my life. After 40 years of grinding through long shifts, missed holidays, and sleepless nights to give my family a comfortable life, I finally reached the finish line. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. My retirement party wasn't just a celebration of a career ending, but of a new chapter I thought I would share with my wife and children. I had no idea what awaited me. The hall was filled with laughter, chatter, and the clinking of glasses. Colleagues I had worked with for decades came forward to shake my hand and offer their congratulations. Some told stories about late-night deadlines I helped them push through, others about the times I covered their shifts when emergencies hit. I smiled through it all, humbled and proud. In that moment, I felt like a man whose sacrifices had meant something. The stage was decorated with golden balloons spelling out "Happy Retirement," and a slideshow of my career highlights played on a large screen. My wife, dressed elegantly as always, sat at a table near the front. She had been my anchor for most of my life, or at least I believed she was. Seeing her there, sipping champagne and nodding politely as people approached her, filled me with warmth. My children were by her side, chatting with one another, occasionally glancing toward me with smiles. I thought those smiles were filled with pride. I thought they were my reward for being the husband and father who never failed them. As I looked around, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude. This was my moment. Not because of the achievements on the screen or the praises being spoken, but because of the family sitting right there, sharing it with me. I took a deep breath and thought, this is what I worked for. This is the life I built. This is love. The program moved along with speeches from my boss, my closest friend at work, and even a couple of younger colleagues who spoke of how I mentored them. Each word felt like a final bow on my career. When the microphone was finally handed to me, I stood, feeling a swell of emotions. The applause thundered as I walked to the podium. My heart pounded not from nerves, but from sheer joy. I opened with humor, recalling a few workplace blunders, and the crowd laughed with me. Then I shifted, speaking from the heart. I thanked my colleagues, my friends, and finally, with my voice catching slightly, I turned to my wife and kids. "You've been my strength," I said. "Every long night, every overtime shift, every sacrifice, I did it for you. And today, as I retire, I look forward to spending the rest of my life with the people who mean the most to me." At that moment, I believed it with all my heart. I didn't know that the very people I was thanking would soon betray me in the cruelest way possible. As the applause continued to ripple through the room and people came forward to shake my hand, I glanced toward my wife, expecting to find her eyes shining with pride, perhaps even a tear at the corner as she looked at the man who had given her decades of loyalty and stability. But instead, what I saw was a woman detached from the moment, her head bent slightly as the blue light of her phone screen illuminated her face, her fingers moving quickly across the glass as if the conversation happening there mattered more than the life we had built together. She hardly looked up, offering only polite nods when someone tried to engage her, and every time our eyes met, she broke contact almost immediately, as though she was bored or inconvenienced by the entire event. I tried to brush it off at first, convincing myself that maybe she was answering a message from a relative who couldn't attend or perhaps arranging something important for later, but the longer I watched her, the more obvious it became that she was disengaged from everything happening around her. When one of my colleagues made a heartfelt toast about the sacrifices I had made for the company, I instinctively turned toward her, waiting for her to smile or squeeze my hand, but she simply raised her champagne glass halfway, her gaze still glued to her phone, and then placed it back down with a soft clink against the table. The contrast between the warmth pouring out of the room and the coldness radiating from her was sharp enough to sting. Guests whispered among themselves, some exchanging glances that I pretended not to notice because everyone could see it. My wife was not celebrating me. She was somewhere else entirely. I laughed at jokes, thanked well-wishers, and forced my focus outward, but inside my chest there was a growing heaviness, a question I didn't dare ask myself yet. Why wasn't she proud of me? She had been my partner through decades of long hours and missed dinners, or so I thought. Yet here, on the night meant to honor both of us, she looked as though she would rather be anywhere else. I caught moments where she typed quickly, paused to smirk faintly at whatever she was reading, and then resumed her silence, all while my children leaned closer to her, whispering occasionally, as though they too were in on a conversation I wasn't invited to. Each time I tried to engage her, gesturing for her to join me in a photo, or sharing a smile after someone praised my devotion, she responded with a thin, practiced expression that didn't reach her eyes. I told myself she was just tired, that maybe the party overwhelmed her, but deep down a sliver of unease began to pierce the joy I had felt earlier. I didn't know yet the truth that would crush me, but I felt the chill of her absence even while she was sitting right there beside me, and it foreshadowed a betrayal I never imagined possible. The microphone in my hand felt heavier as I reached the most important part of my speech, my heart swelling with gratitude as I turned my attention to my wife and children, the people I had spent decades working for, the reason I endured long hours and sleepless nights. And with every word I spoke, I thought I was weaving together the perfect tribute to them, thanking them for standing by me, for believing in me, for sacrificing with me, and I meant every syllable as I said that now that my career had ended, I looked forward to devoting the rest of my days to them, to making up for lost time, to creating memories free from the weight of obligations, and the room erupted into warm applause. But just as I smiled and turned toward my wife, expecting her to rise and embrace me, she stood with a deliberate slowness that froze the air in the hall. At first, I thought she was going to give her own words, perhaps a toast or some heartfelt sentiment. But instead she walked toward me with her clutch tucked under her arm and a stack of crisp documents in her hand. The applause faded into confused murmurs as she climbed onto the stage, her heels clicking with an unnerving rhythm. And then she stopped beside me, her eyes cool and detached, before extending the papers toward me. I stared, blinking, confused, unable to understand, until I glanced down and saw the bold letters at the top of the page, Petition for Divorce. A hush fell over the room, punctuated only by the sound of a glass breaking somewhere in the back, and I felt every eye in the hall burning into my skin as I struggled to comprehend what was happening. "It's time," she said calmly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone, and her words cut through me like a knife. I froze, my mouth dry, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear anything else. My hands trembled as I accepted the papers, unwilling yet unable to reject them, and the microphone caught my shallow breaths, amplifying my humiliation for everyone to hear. I wanted to laugh it off, to believe it was some cruel joke, but the look on her face told me otherwise. Gasps spread through the crowd, whispers darted back and forth, and my children sat stiffly in their seats, their eyes darting away from mine, confirming with their silence that they had known this was coming all along. My cheeks burned with shame, my pride shattered in an instant, and still my wife stood there with her chin raised high, as though this was her triumph, as though destroying me on the very night meant to honor me was some twisted victory. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stand tall, but inside everything crumbled. The speech I had prepared to end in love and hope had instead turned into the cruelest betrayal of my life, one delivered not in private, but in front of friends, colleagues, and family, ensuring that my humiliation would never be forgotten. The sound of gasps filled the hall like a sudden storm, rippling through the crowd as dozens of eyes turned toward me, pity etched into some faces, shock and disbelief carved into others, and in that instant I felt stripped bare, exposed like a fool in front of the very people who had gathered to honor me. My colleagues, who had respected me for decades, whispered among themselves, their voices carrying fragments of disbelief. Did she really just? While others avoided my gaze entirely, unwilling to look at the man who had just been gutted on his own stage. I stood frozen, divorce papers trembling in my hand, and tried to swallow the knot tightening in my throat, but before I could even gather my composure, my wife turned to the microphone, her voice cold, sharp, and deliberate, carrying across the room with a cruel clarity that silenced even the whispers. "I can't do this anymore," she declared, her eyes narrowing on me. 40 years of routine, of schedules, of the same predictable man coming home late, falling asleep on the couch, always working, always boring. And now that you're retired, now that this is all you have left, I refuse to waste another minute of my life, shackled to a man with no spark, no excitement, no passion. Her words sliced through me, each one delivered like a public execution, and the laughter and applause that had filled the hall minutes earlier seemed like a cruel memory. I heard someone gasp audibly, another mutter, "My God," and the humiliation burned so fiercely I could barely stand. I wanted to shout, to demand why she had chosen this moment, this night of all nights, to destroy me. But my voice was trapped, buried beneath the crushing weight of betrayal. I glanced toward my children, praying for some sign of support, but their eyes darted away, their silence condemning them as accomplices. My son fidgeted with his tie, refusing to meet my gaze, while my daughter bit her lip and looked down at her hands, the guilt written clearly on her face. They knew. They had known, and they had said nothing, done nothing, allowed me to walk into this ambush with a heart full of gratitude and hope. My wife smirked faintly, reveling in the spectacle, as if my destruction was entertainment and the humiliation was complete. I felt the foundation of my life crack beneath me. Everything I thought I had built, marriage, family, loyalty, reduced to dust in front of strangers and loved ones alike. The applause I had earned through years of sacrifice was replaced with whispers of pity and judgment. And I stood there clutching the divorce papers, not just blindsided, but utterly shattered. I had faced challenges in my career, crises that tested my patience and endurance, but nothing compared to this moment, the raw cruelty of being told in front of everyone that I was no longer wanted, no longer loved, no longer enough. My wife's final words echoed in my mind like poison, boring, retired, worthless, and though I kept my posture upright, inside I crumbled, humiliated beyond measure, broken in ways I didn't yet understand. As the echoes of my wife's cruel declaration faded, my eyes instinctively searched for the only other source of comfort I thought I had left: our children. But what I found instead twisted the knife already buried in my chest. They didn't leap to my defense. They didn't storm the stage in outrage. They didn't even whisper words of comfort. Instead, my daughter glanced quickly at my son, her expression heavy with guilt, her lips pressed tightly together as though sealing a secret she dared not speak. And then my son returned that look with the same expression of shame, an acknowledgement between them that they both knew what I had not. The realization hit me harder than the divorce papers, harder than my wife's venomous words. They had known. They had seen this ambush coming, had stood by and let me walk into it blind, had allowed me to believe that this party was a celebration of love and support when in truth it was the stage for my destruction. My knees weakened as I watched them avoid my gaze, pretending to be engrossed in the tablecloth, the wine glasses, the scattered plates of half-eaten food, anything to avoid the raw devastation in my eyes. These were the children I had raised with every ounce of energy I had, the children whose education I paid for, whose futures I protected, whose late-night fears I calmed, and now they sat complicit in the betrayal of their father. My daughter shifted in her seat, fidgeting with her bracelet, her shoulders trembling ever so slightly, but not once did she speak, not once did she stand. My son clenched his jaw, his face flushed with discomfort, but still he remained silent, as if silence could shield him from guilt. Around us, the guests whispered in disbelief, some shaking their heads, others staring at the children as if they too recognized their guilt. I wanted to scream, to demand why they hadn't told me, why they hadn't warned me, why they had let me humiliate myself in front of everyone, but the words lodged in my throat, suffocated by the betrayal. It wasn't just my wife who had turned her back on me. It was the family I had built from nothing, the children I thought would always be on my side. A cold realization seeped into me. Their loyalty was not to me but to her, to their mother, and perhaps even to the comfort of their own futures. By staying silent, by allowing her cruelty to unfold unchecked, they had chosen convenience over courage, betrayal over honesty, and in that moment, as I stood under the harsh lights of the stage clutching divorce papers with trembling hands, I knew something had fractured beyond repair. The audience could see it too, the shame, the complicity, the guilty glances that betrayed everything. My children, my flesh and blood, had watched their father walk into a fire and had chosen to warm their hands instead of pulling me out, and the pain of that truth carved deeper wounds than any words my wife could ever speak. My hand shook so violently that the divorce papers rattled like dry leaves caught in a storm, and I tried to steady them against the podium, pressing the trembling pages flat, as though I could somehow control the chaos consuming me by controlling a piece of paper. But the betrayal was too heavy, too sudden, too raw. The weight of 100 eyes bore down on me. Guests who had come to celebrate my life's work now, forced to witness the collapse of everything I believed in, and my pride, my dignity, my very identity as a husband and father teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet even as tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, I forced my lips into a smile, a grotesque mask of composure, the only shield I had left against total humiliation. My voice caught in my throat, but I laughed weakly into the microphone, muttering something about unexpected surprises, pretending it was all part of some joke, though the bitterness in the room was palpable, and I could hear the pity in the whispers spreading among the tables. I thought if I could just hold myself together, if I could play the part of the unbreakable man for one more minute, I could at least salvage some scrap of dignity, but the tremor in my hands betrayed me. My smile wavered, and my body screamed with the effort of holding back the collapse. And then I saw her, my wife, turning her back on me as if I were nothing more than an afterthought, a footnote in her evening. She walked off the stage with a smugness that was unmistakable, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, her heels clicking proudly against the wooden floor as though she had just won a battle she had long planned. She didn't glance back, not once, because in her mind there was nothing left to see. The room parted for her as she moved, some guests recoiling in shock, others staring in judgment, but she ignored them all, walking straight toward the double doors at the far end of the hall. And then, as if to twist the knife deeper into my chest, I saw him waiting there, her lover, leaning casually against the doorway with a smile that made my blood run cold. He was younger, arrogant, and entirely too comfortable in a place he did not belong, and when she reached him, she slipped her hand into his as naturally as if it had always belonged there. Together they left, her laughter faint but audible, echoing in cruel harmony with the stunned silence left behind. I stood frozen, clutching the papers, my body trembling, my mind a storm of disbelief and agony, while my colleagues, my friends, my family sat in stunned stillness, unsure whether to comfort me or to pretend they hadn't just watched a man's soul shatter. And still I smiled, the broken, pathetic smile of a man determined to mask devastation with a facade of strength, knowing full well that everyone could see right through it. That night the house was silent except for the faint hum of the clock on the wall, its steady ticking mocking the chaos swirling inside me as I sat alone in my study, the divorce papers spread out across the desk like a death sentence waiting for my signature. I had expected to collapse into grief, to bury my face in my hands and sob for the life I thought I had, but no tears came. My chest burned, my throat ached, and yet my eyes remained dry, because something deeper than sorrow had settled in me, something sharper and more dangerous than despair. I leaned back in my chair, staring at those papers as though they were an enemy I could not yet touch, and instead of drowning in pain, my mind began to turn, slow at first, then faster, like gears grind into life after years of rust. Every cruel word my wife had spoken replayed in my head, every guilty glance from my children, every whisper in the hall, and each one stoked the fire building in the pit of my stomach. She thought she had ended me in public, stripping me of my dignity, reducing me to a joke in front of the people I had spent a lifetime impressing. She thought she had humiliated me beyond recovery, but she had underestimated me, underestimated the strength that had carried me through 4 decades of relentless work, underestimated the resolve of a man who had sacrificed everything for his family. I picked up the papers, running my fingers over the crisp legal language, and instead of seeing them as a symbol of loss, I began to see them as an opportunity, the opening move in a game she had no idea I knew how to play. The anger that surged through me was cold, not wild, not reckless, but calculating, steady, deliberate. I realized in that moment that I would not beg her to stay. I would not plead with my children to love me. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me collapse. No, I would give them something else entirely. I would give them regret. I would give them nights of staring at the ceiling, wondering how they had so easily betrayed the man who would have given them everything. I would give them the bitter taste of realizing too late that they had thrown away the one person who truly cared for them. My pen tapped against the desk as ideas began to form, not of reconciliation, not of forgiveness, but of strategy, of leverage, of quiet retribution that would strip away the comfort they had taken for granted. The study, once my sanctuary for work and reflection, became the war room for something greater than survival. It became the birthplace of revenge. The clock ticked on, marking the death of my old life and the birth of a man who would not weep, but would rise, patient and precise, to make them all regret what they had done. The days that followed were a blur of routine on the surface, but strategy beneath, because to everyone else I was a broken man, licking his wounds. But in truth, I had begun the careful work of peeling back the lies that had wrapped themselves around my marriage for years. I started with her phone records, something she must have assumed I would never check, but retirement had granted me the one resource she had taken for granted: time. I studied call logs and message patterns, noticing late-night conversations that stretched for hours, numbers saved under false names that repeated with alarming frequency, and gaps in her schedule that lined up perfectly with evenings she had claimed to be running errands or visiting friends. Each discovery hardened me further, stripping away the remnants of the love I once felt, replacing it with an icy focus that kept me from collapsing under the truth. From there, I traced her credit card bills, purchases that spoke louder than words, dinners at restaurants I had never been invited to, weekend getaways disguised as work conferences, gifts charged discreetly but carelessly, all pointing to a relationship that had thrived behind my back. But the most painful revelation came not from her, but from my children. Old memories began to click into place. Nights when my daughter casually mentioned Mom being out later than expected. Times my son brushed off my concerns with a quick excuse. Moments I had ignored because I trusted them. I began to see their complicity written across the timeline, subtle cover-ups that made sense only now. I found emails, messages, and even photographs tucked away in shared cloud folders, evidence so damning it made my stomach turn. And what seared me most was that my children had helped her weave the lies tighter, had chosen silence instead of honesty. They had shielded her from my suspicion, convincing me I was overthinking whenever doubts crept in, all while watching me work myself into exhaustion for a family that no longer respected me. Late at night, I sat in my study with these pieces of evidence spread before me, the documents, the receipts, the records, and each one felt like another nail in the coffin of the man I used to be. There was no more guessing, no more wondering if perhaps I was overreacting. The truth was undeniable, and it was filthier than I ever imagined. My wife had been living a double life, and my children had helped her keep it hidden. Yet even as the bitterness burned in my veins, I felt an eerie calm, because now I had what I needed. Knowledge was power, and power meant control, and control meant I was no longer the humiliated fool standing on a stage clutching divorce papers. I was a man with the truth in his hands, and with that truth, I would build a plan so devastating they would never recover from it. When the truth of the affair had settled firmly in my chest, heavy but undeniable, I turned my attention to the one thing I had always guarded with meticulous care: my finances. If betrayal had poisoned the love I once felt, it had not dulled my instincts, and so I logged into my accounts late at night, the glow of the screen casting a pale light across the study, as I traced the path of every dollar I had earned over 4 decades of sacrifice. The numbers were comforting in a way, precise and orderly, unlike the chaos of my broken marriage. Yet as I studied them, a new realization began to take shape, one even more insidious than the affair itself. My wife and children had not simply betrayed me emotionally, they had been waiting, circling like vultures, for the moment when my career ended so they could feed on the wealth I had built. Retirement was supposed to be freedom, the reward for years of loyalty to company and family, but in their eyes, it was nothing more than the unlocking of an inheritance, the release of assets they believed were already theirs. I saw it in the patterns of recent withdrawals my wife had made, casual but calculated, as though she already considered herself the sole owner of what we had once shared. I saw it in the way my children had grown careless. My daughter speaking openly weeks earlier about how things would be easier soon. My son casually mentioning upgrades he planned for his apartment, despite not having the income to justify them. At the time, I had dismissed these as harmless comments, but now, with the knowledge of their complicity in the affair, I understood the deeper truth. They all assumed my hard-earned money was theirs by default. They underestimated me, though. They thought the man who had spent his life balancing budgets, making investments, building a future from nothing, would suddenly become blind and naive the moment he collected his final paycheck. They assumed retirement meant weakness, that I would fold easily, sign whatever documents were put in front of me, and leave them to enjoy the fruits of my labor. But they were wrong. I studied the details of pensions, savings, investment accounts, property deeds, and I saw clearly that I still held the reins. Nothing had slipped beyond my control, no matter how smugly my wife walked out of that hall with her lover. My assets were not theirs to claim, not yet, not unless I allowed it, and that gave me the leverage I needed. As the numbers filled the screen, a plan began to crystallize, sharper than the rage coursing through me. They wanted comfort, security, and a guaranteed inheritance, but what they had failed to calculate was the intelligence of the man they betrayed. I was not just a retired worker with nothing left to give. I was a strategist with the power to erase every expectation they had of an easy future, and in that moment, I swore I would do exactly that. The morning after my discovery, the world outside seemed deceptively ordinary. Birds singing on the lawn as though nothing had collapsed inside me, but I was already moving into a different phase of my life, one driven not by love or family duty, but by precision and vengeance. I rose early, dressed in the same suit I had worn countless times to board meetings, and drove quietly to an office across town where my lawyer had agreed to meet me discreetly. Sitting across from him in the polished conference room, I explained without a tremor in my voice that I wished to restructure everything, my accounts, my will, my estate, so that the wife and children who had mocked me with their betrayal would find nothing waiting for them when they came to collect. My lawyer's eyes widened slightly, perhaps sensing the storm beneath my calm exterior, but he nodded and began drafting the paperwork. Together, we devised methods to move funds into trusts they could not touch, to close the joint accounts my wife had so casually dipped her hands into, and to establish ironclad protections that would outlast even the dirtiest divorce tricks. Later that day, I met with my financial advisor, a man who had overseen my investments for years, and I laid out a new strategy with sharp clarity. We shifted portfolios, rerouted dividends, and secured assets under entities my wife didn't even know existed. I watched the balance shift on his screen, watched the security net tighten around me, and for the first time, since that humiliating night at the retirement party, I felt a flicker of control returning to my chest. It wasn't enough to simply protect my money. I wanted to weaponize it. I wanted the very inheritance they had counted on to become a ghost, a shadow that would vanish the moment they reached for it. My will was rewritten that afternoon with ruthless precision. Gone were the generous provisions I had once set aside for my children, the college funds, the inheritances that would have cushioned their futures. In their place, I named charities, organizations that would value the sacrifices of a hard-working man far more than the family who had spat on his devotion. My lawyer asked once, with quiet caution, if I was certain. I looked him directly in the eye and said I had never been more certain of anything. When I returned home that night, the house was quiet, My wife still out, God knows where, but I sat in my study and opened the folder of fresh documents, the ink still drying. Each signature I had given was not just a legal formality, but a stroke of justice, a declaration that I would not be stripped bare by the people I loved most. They thought retirement meant weakness, but I was proving to myself with every move that it could also mean liberation. This was only the first step of revenge, but already I could taste the bitter satisfaction of the ruin that awaited them. I made the call in the late afternoon, my voice measured, carrying the perfect tone of weariness and resignation. "Why don't we all have dinner tonight?" I said to my wife, who barely concealed her surprise. "I think it's time we talk as a family. No more anger. I've accepted things." The word tasted like ash on my tongue, but I let it linger as though it were truth. She hesitated only a moment before agreeing, clearly confident that I was broken, that I would swallow the humiliation like an old dog too tired to bark. The children, too, responded quickly, their voices light with relief, and I could almost hear the smugness threading their replies, believing their father was finally conceding defeat. That evening, I set the table myself in the dining room, choosing a bottle of wine I knew they all loved, arranging the silverware, and letting the soft glow of the chandelier bathe everything in false warmth. When they arrived, my wife's perfume hit me first, sharp and floral, mingled with the faint, smug smile she carried, as though the papers she had handed me days earlier were already etched into stone. My son and daughter followed, greeting me politely, almost too politely, as if I were a fragile vase about to shatter at any sudden movement. I played the role perfectly. I lowered my shoulders, softened my voice, and let my eyes dim just enough to appear weary. I told them I was sorry for how things had unfolded, that maybe I had been blind to their needs, too focused on work, too distracted by ambition. I said that I could not undo the past, but that I wanted to at least part ways with dignity. My wife sipped her wine, nodding with a practiced sorrow that didn't reach her eyes, and the kids exchanged glances of almost guilty relief, clearly convinced that their betrayal was already forgiven. I leaned back, sighing deeply, staring at the faces I had once adored, and I let them believe they were winning, that I was shrinking into the shadows of old age while they stepped into a brighter, freer future without me. Inside, however, my mind was a machine, cold and precise, calculating every step that would follow. Their laughter throughout the meal, the light conversations about trivial matters, even the way my wife occasionally checked her phone with that sly little smile, all of it fed the fire inside me, stoking the resolve that had carried me this far. By dessert, I raised my glass and told them I loved them even now. Even in the ruins of what we had been, my daughter's eyes softened. My son gave me a nod of approval, and my wife almost smirked, believing she had broken me so completely that I had no choice but to cling to the scraps of affection she tossed my way. But when I looked at them across that table, I was no longer their father, no longer her husband. I was the quiet architect of their undoing, and they had no idea the walls were already closing in. I let the dinner linger with the right amount of sentimentality, timing each word like a surgeon's incision, delicate yet deliberate. Between bites of food and polite laughter, I began to weave threads of suggestion, carefully crafted bait meant to stir the greed I knew simmered just beneath their skin. I spoke about the retirement payout, feigning an almost casual slip of the tongue, as if I were an old man too proud of his career to keep quiet about the rewards it had brought. "It's strange," I said, fiddling with my fork. "After all those years of long hours, the company really took care of me. The retirement package was more generous than I could have imagined. Sometimes I wonder if I even deserve it. I laughed self-deprecatingly, and my wife's eyes flickered up from her glass, sharp with sudden interest, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of polite indifference. My son leaned forward slightly, his voice mild but laced with hunger. "Generous, huh? How generous are we talking, Dad?" I chuckled as if the question embarrassed me, as if I were naive enough not to notice the calculation behind it. "Oh, nothing too grand," I said, brushing it off. "Just enough to make sure your mother and you two are comfortable when I'm gone." I emphasized the words, "when I'm gone," and I saw the way they latched onto it, their expressions betraying more than they realized. My daughter forced a smile, her voice lilting with false concern. "That's good to hear, Dad. You've worked hard. You deserve peace now." She said the right words, but her eyes glimmered in a way that reminded me of a child catching sight of a wrapped present before Christmas. I pretended not to notice, instead leaning back with a sigh, swirling the wine in my glass. "I've already been talking to my financial advisor about structuring everything properly. You know, trusts, wills, that sort of thing. It's a headache at my age, but I want to make sure you three never have to worry." My wife's fingers tightened around her glass, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. The small smirk tugged at the corner of her lips, the same smirk she had worn when she slid the divorce papers into my hand in front of my colleagues, believing she had broken me beyond repair. Now she thought I was crawling back to her, desperate for approval, too weak to fight, ready to reward her betrayal with a fortune. I let them wallow in that illusion. I nodded solemnly, adding, "Sometimes I think maybe God is giving me a second chance to set things right. I don't want to leave this world with bitterness. I'd rather leave with love and generosity." They bought every word, mistaking performance for weakness. I saw it in the way their shoulders relaxed, in the way their tones softened, in the way their eyes gleamed with premature victory. I hid my smile behind the rim of my glass, knowing the seeds had been planted, seeds of greed that would grow wild and blind them to the trap slowly tightening around them. It did not take long for the mask to slip completely from her face, for the smugness she had been barely restraining at that dinner to transform into full-blown arrogance that poisoned every interaction thereafter. She no longer bothered to hide her affair, no longer cared to keep whispers behind closed doors. She paraded him around in town like a prize she had earned, posting pictures on social media with captions that oozed with ridicule, subtle enough for outsiders to assume innocence, but sharp enough for me to feel the sting she intended. At the grocery store, she would brush his arm and giggle loud enough for acquaintances to turn and stare, as if to remind the world and me that she had traded in her boring old husband for someone younger, fresher, and more exciting. The audacity was staggering, but I let it roll off me like rain on stone, because every sneer and every careless display only fueled the fire I kept hidden beneath my calm exterior. At home, the disdain seeped into her words like venom. She called me washed up to my face, her tone light as though it were a harmless joke, but the edge in her voice betrayed her satisfaction in belittling me. "You should be grateful," she said one evening while filing her nails at the kitchen table. "At least now you can rest and leave the real living to those of us who still have a pulse." My son, sitting nearby with his phone in hand, chuckled at her cruelty, shaking his head as though I were some pitiful relic. "She's right, Dad," he said without even looking at me. "Retirement has you acting like a ghost. Maybe it's time you stopped clinging to things and let Mom have her happiness." My daughter, once tender and affectionate, began parroting the same disdain, sighing dramatically whenever I spoke, rolling her eyes when I offered advice, dismissing my presence with a wave of her hand. "Dad, you're stressing over nothing," she snapped when I questioned her reckless spending. "Mom's right. You need to stop acting like you matter in every decision." The sting of betrayal burned more deeply than their words, because their cruelty was not born from ignorance but from choice, from siding with her in exchange for the promise of comfort, wealth, and favor once she disposed of me completely. They treated me like a burden, as though I were an old coat to be discarded, useful once but now a nuisance in their shiny new lives. I played along, nodding meekly, lowering my eyes, embodying the role of the broken man they believed me to be. But inside I memorized every word, every mocking laugh, every smirk exchanged between them when they thought I was too slow to notice. They mistook silence for surrender, weakness for defeat. What they did not understand was that arrogance always precedes downfall, and theirs would be spectacular. The higher they flaunted their contempt, the harder their fall would be when the trap finally snapped shut. The day I walked into my lawyer's office to sign the final stack of documents, I felt a calm I had not known in months, a cold serenity that replaced the trembling humiliation I had once endured. Every line of text, every signature was a blade carefully sharpened for the reckoning to come. My wife thought she had outmaneuvered me, that flaunting her affair and mocking me openly had broken my spirit into submission. But the truth was, I had been busy rewriting the script of our lives in silence. The divorce settlement was the first strike. Instead of allowing her to waltz off with half of everything I had worked for, the paperwork laid out ironclad terms. She would receive nothing beyond what she had personally contributed, which was nearly nothing at all. Years of foresight had safeguarded my accounts, and now with the transfer of assets and closure of joint accounts, her grasping hands would find only empty air where she expected wealth. The second strike was the will. I sat across from my lawyer as he reviewed the clauses, making absolutely certain that every loophole was sealed. My children, once the pride of my life, were now absent from every page. Not a cent, not a scrap of property would flow to them when my time ended. Instead, the estate was redirected into carefully structured trust funds, established for charities I had quietly supported for years, for friends who had stood by me when my own blood had turned traitor, for organizations that would build something lasting rather than squander it on greed. It gave me grim satisfaction to imagine the shock on their faces when they discovered their inheritance. An inheritance they had already begun to count as their own had slipped away like sand through their fingers. As the lawyer slid the final document across the polished wood desk, he looked at me with a mixture of respect and pity. "This is thorough," he said, adjusting his glasses. "They'll have no recourse once this is filed. Are you certain you want to go through with cutting them out completely?" I met his eyes without hesitation. "They made their choice the moment they betrayed me," I answered. "Family is loyalty, not blood. They gave that up." He nodded solemnly and affixed his signature, stamping the papers with the seal that made them binding and irreversible. I gathered the documents into a leather folder, my hand steady, my heart resolute. The weight of betrayal had once crushed me, but now the weight of justice steadied me, anchored me with purpose. Walking out of that office, I passed strangers who had no idea that beneath the calm face of an aging man was a storm carefully contained, ready to be unleashed when the time was right. Every step I took home was a march toward the day when the masks would fall and their arrogance would be met with ruin. They believed they had destroyed me, but in truth, I had only just begun. The dining room was dressed for celebration again, but this time it wasn't my retirement party. It was the stage for the act I had carefully scripted. My wife had insisted on this gathering, believing it to be the symbolic moment of her freedom, the final push to parade her victory and my supposed defeat. She wore a smug smile as she entered with her lover lingering outside in the driveway, confident that I was nothing more than a washed-up, discarded husband, whose only role left was to sign away what she thought was hers. My children sat around the table, their eyes a mixture of expectation and guilt, though the greed had dulled their shame to a faint shadow. They had convinced themselves that by siding with their mother, they had secured their futures. I played my part to perfection. Slouched in my chair, shoulders heavy, voice soft and tired, I gave them the impression of a broken man who had accepted his fate. My wife clinked her glass against mine, announcing in a voice dripping with mockery, "To new beginnings." Her tone carried a cruel joy, and the kids chuckled nervously, unsure whether to fully laugh at their father or remain cautious. I let the toast pass, then folded my hands on the table. "Yes," I said quietly, "to new beginnings. And tonight is indeed a beginning, though not the one you think." Their smiles faltered. My wife leaned back, her brows furrowing slightly as she searched my face for weakness. Instead, I pulled the leather folder from beside my chair and set it on the table with a deliberate thud. The sound cut through the room like a gavel. I opened it slowly, revealing the stack of documents with official seals and signatures. "You expected tonight to be the end of me," I said evenly, my voice no longer trembling but sharp and commanding. "You thought I would hand you everything I built, everything I sacrificed decades for. But the truth is, while you were mocking me, I was preparing." I slid the divorce papers across the table, already stamped and filed. "These are finalized. You get nothing." My wife's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief. The children stared, their eyes wide, as I continued. "The accounts you thought were yours to inherit are gone from your reach. My will has been rewritten. Not a single coin of my estate will fall into your hands. Every asset, every property, every investment has been redirected to people and causes that value loyalty over betrayal." My daughter whispered. "Dad, you can't," but I cut her off, slamming my palm on the table with a force that made the glasses rattle. "I already have. While you plotted against me, I outplayed you. You thought I was weak, but I was watching, planning, and sealing every door you thought would open for you." Silence blanketed the room, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing. My wife's arrogance had evaporated, replaced by stunned fury. My children looked as if the ground had disappeared beneath their feet. And for the first time since that night of humiliation, I looked them all in the eyes without flinching. "This is my freedom," I declared, my voice firm, steady, and final. The air was already thick with tension after I revealed the truth about the will and finances, but what came next shattered every illusion they had clung to. I reached beneath the table and pulled out another folder, this one heavier, sealed with evidence I had spent weeks gathering in silence. "Since tonight is about beginnings," I said coldly, "let us begin with honesty." My wife narrowed her eyes, attempting to regain composure, but the twitch at the corner of her lips betrayed her. I opened the folder and spread out a collection of photographs, each one clearer than the last. Her and her lover, hands entwined in public, kissing in hotel lobbies, checking into rooms under fake names they thought would shield them. Gasps filled the room as relatives leaned forward, their mouths covered, whispers slicing through the heavy silence. I placed another stack beside the photos, this time printed text messages, exchanges dripping with intimacy and mockery of me. My wife's own words jumped out in bold ink. "He's too busy planning his retirement to notice anything." Another message read, "The kids cover for me when I'm late. He'll never suspect." My wife's face blanched, her bravado collapsing into panic as her eyes darted to the children, silently pleading for help. But I wasn't finished. "You thought your affair was hidden. But it wasn't just you," I continued, sliding forward phone logs and credit card statements showing late-night calls, hotel charges, and cash withdrawals. Then I revealed the final piece, their children's complicity. "Every time you slipped away claiming errands or headaches, they knew," I said, my voice growing harder. "They covered your lies, they stood guard for your betrayal, and they allowed me to stand like a fool in front of the world." I turned to my son, who sat frozen, pale and trembling. "That night you said you were studying at the library. You were actually driving her to her lover's house. Do you deny it?" He shook his head frantically, stammering, "Dad, I—" But the room was already buzzing with judgment. My daughter tried to speak, but I pulled up her string of texts to her mother, warning her about when I was home early. "Don't come back yet. Dad's already in the living room." One of them read, "The relatives who once saw us as a model family now stared in disbelief, their murmurs cutting deeper than any blade." My wife slammed her fist on the table, shrieking, "This is private!" But her voice was drowned out by the avalanche of shame rolling over her. I stood tall, my voice steady. "You made it public the moment you humiliated me at my retirement party. You tore our family apart in front of friends and colleagues. Now you will face the same stage of exposure." The room erupted, relatives standing, shaking their heads, whispering condemnation. My children sat in stunned silence, the weight of their complicity now undeniable, while my wife stared at the damning evidence spread before her like shards of a broken life she could never glue back together. The silence that followed the exposure of their betrayal was suffocating, but I wasn't finished. I reached for a final envelope, thicker than the rest, and slid it across the table so everyone could see the official seals and notarized stamps. My wife's trembling fingers twitched, but she didn't dare touch it. I cleared my throat, my voice calm, almost measured, though every word was sharpened steel. "You thought you were building a future on my back, waiting for me to retire, waiting for the day I would hand everything over to you. But that future is gone." I opened the envelope and revealed the legal documents, deeds, bank closures, and the finalized trust agreements. "The house you live in, it's no longer yours to inherit. The deed has been transferred to the foundation that actually cared for me when my own family betrayed me. The cars in the garage, sold. The retirement accounts you thought you'd drain, moved to charitable trusts and scholarships for children who know what it means to work hard, not to leech off others. My will has been rewritten. Every cent, every possession, every asset you thought you had a claim to, erased from your grasp forever." My wife's jaw dropped, her voice cracking into a shrill wail. "You can't do this." "That's my life too!" she shrieked, clutching at the documents as if she could rip them apart and undo what had been signed in stone. I pulled them back, firm and unyielding. "You forfeited any right to my life the moment you handed me divorce papers in front of my friends and colleagues, humiliating me on what should have been a celebration. You thought retirement made me weak, boring, disposable. But retirement gave me time to think, to plan, to remove every ounce of security you took for granted. The children who once looked smug in their complicity, now paled with terror. My son gripped the edge of the table, whispering, "Dad, please, you can't leave us with nothing." We counted on that money, we thought. His words broke into a sob, but I cut him off with an icy glare. You thought wrong. You stood by and watched your mother tear me apart. You lied for her, covered for her, and let me believe I had a family worth loving. You are not entitled to my sacrifice. You are not entitled to my blood, sweat, and years. My daughter began to cry, tears streaking her face as she muttered, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." But her excuses melted under the weight of reality. Around us, relatives and friends whispered in disgust, some shaking their heads at the pitiful sight of them unraveling. I pressed the stack of documents flat against the table, my voice final, immovable. The life you built on my shoulders has crumbled. The security you assumed was waiting for you is gone. You will live with the knowledge that greed, betrayal, and arrogance cost you everything. Their faces collapsed into despair, and for the first time in years, I felt the power return to me, standing tall above the ruins of their broken illusions. The moment the truth settled in, the room shifted into chaos. My wife, who had strutted for months with the confidence of a queen, now looked like a desperate woman stripped of her crown. Her face twisted, the arrogant smile gone, replaced by panic as she clutched her phone with shaking hands. She dialed frantically, trying to reach the man she thought would stand beside her in this new life of hers. The phone rang, then rang again, until the silence confirmed what I already knew: he had vanished. She called again, this time with her voice rising into a scream. "Pick up! Answer me! You promised me everything!" Her shrill cries echoed against the walls, but no one came to rescue her. The lover she flaunted was only ever there for one thing: access to the wealth she assumed she would inherit. Now that the money was gone, so was he. She dropped the phone onto the table, her hands covering her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You don't understand," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "He loved me. He said we'd start fresh, travel the world, live better than we ever did." I leaned forward, my voice steady as ice. "He loved your access to my money. Without it, you're just another aging woman who betrayed her husband. Do you see it now? You were never his prize. You were his investment, and the second it failed, he pulled out." Gasps filled the room from those who hadn't fully grasped the affair until now. She wailed, slamming her fist against the table, makeup smudging down her face as her perfect image crumbled. The children sat frozen, watching their mother unravel, their own panic simmering beneath the surface. My son broke first, his voice trembling. "Dad, what about us? You can't just cut us off. We counted on that future. It was supposed to be ours." He gripped his hair, pulling at it in frustration, unable to face the reality that the easy road he had envisioned was gone forever. My daughter cried openly, shaking her head as if denial could erase the documents sitting on the table. "I thought we'd always have security," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I thought no matter what, we'd be safe." I stared at them, no pity left in me. "You thought wrong. You chose greed over loyalty. You chose comfort over truth. And now you get nothing." Their panic was raw, their entitlement melting into desperation as they realized their futures had been built on sand. My wife's sobs grew louder, her cries of, "He'll come back, he has to come back," piercing the air. But even her children looked at her with new eyes, now disgust, disappointment, and fear. The image of the strong matriarch who mocked her husband had shattered into a pathetic figure, abandoned by her lover, disowned by her husband, and rejected by her own kin. I stood over them all, unshaken, knowing justice had finally started to dig its claws deep into the ones who had once celebrated my downfall. The storm of tears and desperate voices faded behind me as I turned my back on the broken shells of the people I once called family. Their cries of entitlement, their pleas for forgiveness, their sudden declarations of love meant nothing to me now. I had given them decades of loyalty, years of sacrifice, and a life built from the sweat of my brow. And in return, they had spit on it the moment they smelled freedom and money. But now, the tables had turned, and I was no longer their victim. I walked away with my head held high, my body lighter than it had felt in years, as if the chains of betrayal had been unshackled at last. I was financially secure, not because of what I had kept, but because of what I had preserved from their greedy hands. The assets I worked for were not going to fund their arrogance, but instead were secured with trusted friends, meaningful charities, and organizations that would actually honor the legacy of my life's work. The money I had spent decades saving would build scholarships for hard-working youth, fund medical programs that helped the poor, and support veterans who had been left behind by the very society they served. Every peso, every dollar, every ounce of value I owned would now breathe life into causes that mattered, not into the pockets of selfish parasites. I found strength in knowing that strangers would one day remember my name with gratitude, while those who bore my name would remember it with regret. True liberation came not from revenge alone, but from reclaiming my purpose. For too long, I had defined myself as husband and father, bending over backward to fulfill every role they demanded of me. Yet now, free of their expectations, I finally stood as my own man, not an extension of their greed. My loyal friends, the ones who never turned their backs, stood beside me. They had witnessed my humiliation at the retirement party. They had seen me stumble under the weight of betrayal, and now they watched me rise stronger than ever. They congratulated me not just on surviving, but on thriving, reminding me that loyalty was worth more than blood. I shared a quiet toast with them, not to what I lost, but to what I had gained: clarity, freedom, and a future where I was no longer bound by those who secretly wished for my downfall. The world beyond my shattered home looked brighter, filled with possibility. I realized I was not at the end of my journey, but at the beginning of a new chapter, one that I would write without deceitful hands pulling at the ink. The liberation was not in punishing them alone, but in choosing to live well, to invest in good soil rather than rotten roots. For the first time in years, I breathed deeply, inhaling peace instead of bitterness. I was free, and that freedom was mine forever. In the quiet after the storm, the truth of everything settled like dust over a battlefield. My wife, the woman who once vowed to stand by me through sickness and health, now found herself abandoned, discarded by the very lover she had thought would be her escape. Without the money, she was nothing to him, and so he left her with only the bitter taste of regret and the weight of choices she could never undo. The kids, once so eager to side with her, now stared at a future stripped bare of inheritance, comfort, or easy living. They struggled to make ends meet, forced to face the reality that their betrayal had cost them not only my financial support, but my presence from their lives. I heard whispers of them bickering, blaming each other for the ruin, some sinking into debt, others crawling back to jobs they once considered beneath them. They thought my wealth would be their safety net, but greed had cut the strings, leaving them to crash hard on the ground of reality. And as they drowned in regret, I walked in peace. My home was quiet, not with loneliness, but with freedom. There was dignity in my solitude, dignity in knowing that I had reclaimed my life from those who sought to use it as a stepping stone. Each morning I woke without the heaviness of wondering where my wife was, without the false smiles of children hiding knives behind their backs. My friends, the ones who never wavered, filled the silence with laughter and loyalty, and my heart was lighter with every reminder that loyalty, not blood, defines true family. I saw the charities I funded come alive, watched reports of young people starting school with scholarships bearing my name, saw photos of communities receiving aid that made their burdens a little lighter. My wealth, my legacy, was no longer a prize for betrayers, but a blessing for the deserving. That knowledge gave me a satisfaction far deeper than revenge, for in truth, revenge had been only the spark. The real fire was the life I chose to live beyond betrayal. Sometimes, when memories of the party resurface, of the gasps, the humiliation, the papers slapped into my hands in front of everyone, I almost feel pity for them. Almost. But then I remember the smugness on her face, the betrayal in their eyes, the arrogance of believing I was too blind to see. That memory steals me again, reminding me why I chose this path. In the final reflection of my story, I see two pictures. One of them haunted by their own choices, struggling in shadows of regret, and one of me walking in sunlight, free, respected, and at peace. They thought they had written the end of my life when they handed me those papers at my retirement party, but they were wrong. That moment was not the end, it was my beginning. And in the end, I won, because I chose to live with peace, dignity, and the satisfaction of justice served. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.